My name is Lloyd Coleman, and I'm the Associate Music Director of Power Orchestra. Welcome to this second webinar. We had the first last week talking about this topic of breaking down cultural barriers in the music industry for deaf and disabled musicians and composers. We had three wonderful speakers last week: Joe Thomas, Mark Pavey, and Gareth Churchill. And this week we have another three equally wonderful speakers in the form of Ben Lunn, Sarah Leanne Lewis, and Troy Lee. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being with us today. They are going to speak in turn about their experiences in a moment. They'll have about 10 minutes each to talk about their perspectives on this topic of the cultural barriers in the music industry that they might have faced themselves, and indeed they might have overcome themselves. And then after about 45 minutes of that, we'll take a short break so that we don't become all Zoomified out. I'm sure many of you, like me, have been on many Zooms throughout this lockdown period or throughout this year. So we'll take a short break at about 4:45, 10:05, and then we'll come back and have your questions. I'd really like to encourage, I can't see any of you, the audience at the moment, who are joining us today, but I'd like to encourage you to submit your questions either via the Q&A chat bar that Rachel mentioned already, or you can save your questions until the second part of this webinar and ask them directly of the panel. That's enough from me. I'm going to hand over straight away to our first guest, composer Ben Lunn. Ben, would you like to just... I'm not going to introduce any of our guests. I'd like you to introduce yourself, if that's okay, and to give us your perspective on this topic. Thank you, Ben.
Diolch, Lloyd, and Prynhawn da, everyone. It is wonderful to be speaking to you all in Wales, and I'm very sad that I'm not there in person currently. So, as Lloyd said, I am a composer by trade. I am currently sat in my flat in Airdrie. For those who need it, I've got a nice little beard growing, giant headphones on, and my lovely fleecy jumper that makes me look particularly Danish today. So yes, as composer, I initially studied in Wales, and that's partly where my love of the nation came from more than anything else. But now living, working in Scotland, and I've been all over the place in various different guises, either through study or through work and so on. And the question of relationship to disability, and also the way disability links to classical music in particular, has been quite an interesting journey for me to learn about and to also sort of get engaged with. To give sort of a sense of the background, with Sunderland, my hometown, being made a city in 1992, they then managed to get a huge amount of support in various different elements, and one of these areas was in things like speech and language therapy and so on, which, as I was also diagnosed as being autistic very young, this meant I had a lot of access to some really wonderful support from essentially from the age of 5, which then meant I was able to actually communicate, interact with everyone almost like the normies. And so then that meant that for quite a long time my relationship to my disabledness was quite a negative one, mostly because I was always brought up with the world isn't built for us, we have to adapt to the world around us. And what has been interesting, looking particularly at the way discussions around autism and disability and has gone in general, is it has shifted from a matter of just coping with the world around us to and pointing out that the world is built wrong and it can be shifted very easily to be more accommodating to us. In terms of music, however, it's quite interesting in the sense of the way the barriers all line up and the way they all intersect with each other. Having worked in lots of different musical environments, being with Drake Music Scotland, with their digital orchestra, or with Dada Fest in their outreach projects, and various other different parts, the big issue we tend to find with classical music and disability is the question of how are the disabled people being engaged? And what we often find in various different elements until fairly recently, that any involvement of disabled people meant outreach and giving something nice to the poor crippled people, the poor deaf people, the poor retards. They need something nice to entertain them, and never actually as something that not only they can contribute to, but also they can interact with on a complex level. And so last year, I had been given a commission from Drake Music Scotland to work with them and Hebrides Ensemble to produce a piece for the digital orchestra and members of Hebrides Ensemble. So what my ultimate aim of that piece was to then make something that could be compared to the great history of classical music and so on, and then but also give the opportunity of just it letting be music by disabled people with disabled people playing and so on, unapologetically in reality. And alongside that, I'd then been given funding to do research into improving access within concerts. And so the Paul Queen's Hall, I gave them a hell of a lot of work to do. We had adapted their accessibility document entirely, which then now lists everything from size of stairs, width of hallways, smells and other senses that you impact in the room, as well as producing a video which simply dictates how you go about going into the concert hall, getting your ticket, where is busy, where is quiet, and all those kind of elements, simply because I think mostly because being disabled myself, I knew that as long as I'm comfortable, I can deal with a lot of very complex and very challenging art. And so any music for disabled people should always do in that kind of instance, because often we find that more accessible concerts, like with the prom last year as a particular example, was more aimed at families and children, which is still a very important element, but we're still disabled after the age of 18. And the majority of the population become disabled well into adulthood. So this is a real cognitive dissonance that we need to address. Another element, as well as just being a composer in this, is very difficult, because when you look at similar situations that women composers have to deal with, composers of any ethnic minority have to deal with, is that question of discovering the history you have, because we do have the disabled composers there. However, often our composers are described almost entirely without their disability. Oh, is there a lot of buffering? Is it just me, or is it everyone is hearing me bad? Sorry.
No, I think you're good for me, Ben. It might just be a local internet connection for some people.
Okay.
Carry on, sir.
Okay. So a good example is Gustav Holst. He is never discussed as a disabled composer, despite the simple fact that he was not physically able to play the violin like his father, even though his father wanted him to, but because of the issues he had with his hand, he ended up playing God's instrument, the trombone. The other issue as well is he had issues like because of his hands, he had to write out the planets with a team of supporters. So he would write out manically as much as he could till he had too much pain to be able to compose. His assistants would transcribe it to two pianos and play it to him, and then they'd edit that way. And that's the process of how the planets was composed. And it is quite definitively the most disabled way of working with people and working with assistants, I think, in classical music, and arguably, particularly from British standpoint, one of the most popular pieces of music ever written. And we never really discussed it on that level. Similarly, when we discuss Beethoven, we discuss him going deaf, but we treat it more like, oh, it's a heroic struggle dealing with losing his hearing, and not he just happened to go deaf because he had all the wonderful training and the wonderful mind that he had. He could still do it because he could get pen to paper and make the music, and that was the important bit. And it's always very fascinating just the way we try to talk about these composers completely separated the disability, but they were still very much part of it. And particularly within Beethoven, we talk about that heroic struggle. So everyone knows he's deaf, but don't act like he's deaf. And that's always a really confusing thing to discuss. And so when we look at composers today trying to highlight that, we're in this weird scenario where we have a history and don't have a history at the same time, but we then also are having to try and fight for value. And I think that's the biggest thing that we have in comparison to, say, with women composers. It's a matter of, when we're looking at history, is showing how all of these composers have existed and they've been wrongfully neglected as far back as Hildegard von Bingen, and even further with all the numerous anonymous composers who are most predominantly female. Just that is almost certain the extent of it. We yeah, so because of that kind of scenario, women composers know they have that history and they have that strength to be able to build upon. Whereas disabled people, because we're not taught about that history, and we're also not taught that we can be engaged listeners and in audience members, we're in this scenario where we are too childish to be musicians, or too childish to be composers, or too childish to even be a good member of the audience. And so there's all those kind of levels, and I think the solution is quite difficult because there are sort of multiple layers to address. There is the ideological perceptions we have to address, but there's also the material problems we have to address as well at the same time. Because if we change ideology but don't change the circumstances that allow it to happen, we're just window dressing the problem. Whereas if we change just the material but don't change the ideology, we'll have a huge amount of wonderful performers and composers who are then having to address the various different discriminations in the society. And so it has to be both together being addressed. And so material problems, quite simply, is access to education, which is a huge battle still to this day. The fact that predominantly most people whose native language is BSL can't study in their native language. If someone tried to do that in Wales, the uproar would be huge. If someone tried to suggest that less than 15% of Welsh people should be allowed to learn in their native language, the whole nation would be in uproar. Whereas because the deaf community is spread across all over the place, and because we don't have the support network there, we can't have that same uproar that there should be. There is then also the issue of physicality of instruments. Not all instruments are accessible for disabled people in various different forms. And thankfully, this has led to invention of many things like accessible music technology, or like iPads is a great example, or brain fingers, which is a wonderful thing where you wear a headband and it either measures your brain waves or measures your muscle movement. And it is just magical as an instrument, and I love it greatly. So there's those there, but because they're not mass produced and because they're still very new, there isn't the repertoire and the expertise to make them virtuosic instruments to then draw a lot of attention. And so much in the same way that Adolf Sachs or Lionel Tertis went out of their way to just get everyone to write music for the new instruments that were invented or the instruments that were underrepresented, accessible music technology needs that repertoire to then elevate the standing of the instruments, so then it can be seen as a worthwhile pursuit and endeavor to engage in music. And then for composers, it's a question of talking about our history, describing elements about it, which admittedly is difficult because historically diagnosing people is very complicated and you run the risk of romanticizing elements, but there are still figures who are undeniably, they are disabled, they are deaf, and they need to be discussed in that kind of manner. And then when it comes to the professional world, we've got simple issues like getting performers on stage, both literally and physically, is a very difficult one in the sense of not all stages are literally accessible. So many people just can't get onto it no matter how supportive the environment around them is. If they haven't got the ability to get onto the stage, doesn't matter how supporting you are. If you're not on the stage, that's it. You can't work on that stage. So we have that battle we still have to fight. We then also have to discuss disability as an element that needs to be discussed in regards to communities that are underrepresented. What we often find is when you sort of say like call for schools or looking for new prospective people, you'll always find this wonderful sentence of we welcome entrants from disenfranchised or minority groups such as women, BAME, LGBTQIA, or whatever the particular abbreviation is used in that instance, and then that's the full stop. There isn't very rarely disabled mentioned alongside that, which is beyond infuriating to then, because it has such material problems and it is such a big issue, but we're not even considered an issue to be talked about. And so it's a very difficult one to be able to fix. It's not going to be fixed even instantly, just from the point of view of our modern disability rights in Britain are only 25 years old, which is thoroughly depressing when you think about it that way. But then if you also compare it to the fact that women got the vote over 100 years ago, and after 100 years of fighting, we are here. We can talk about how much or whether that is reflective of the work that has been done to make that happen. But if you look at just after the women's vote, 25 years later, the progress wasn't as much. And so the progress for disabled rights is still very small because it is still quite infantile because of various influences and impact. So we need to keep up the hard work. We need to be optimistic because we will eventually get there, even if it's out of sheer stubbornness more than anything else. We'll eventually get there, and we just need to make sure that we can always very clearly point to where the problems are. And I find often discussions around equalities get far too focused on, are these the right words to use? Are these supportive? Is this completely inclusive of the community? Whereas you can chuck any old words around. You can chuck retard, cripple, all the other various different words that are used to describe disabled people. You can get rid of them, but if we're still in a position where the vast majority of disabled people aren't employed, disabled people are still going to have a problem to face. And all of these different elements are really quite difficult to address, but it needs to be made sure that the material is the biggest problem more than anything else. If we don't have a situation where we have an industry that is physically if we have an industry that is physically inaccessible, disabled people can't be involved. If we have an industry that depends on scenarios that forcibly make sure that individuals can't get involved, either because of lack of the ability to communicate in BSL or other sign language, or the necessity to rely on societal interactions, or even just the stamina to be able to live, just to work non-stop every hour of every day, even though for many of us that leaves us far too knackered to wake up the following morning. All of these issues feed into it, and thankfully, because the disabled community are quite good at looking at that broad picture of how we're all affected in a similar but differing way, we can address them bit by bit, but it does also mean progress is very slow. So I think I've waffled on for enough time, so thank you very much, Diolch.
Ben, not at all. Thank you so much for that incredibly rapid race through not just kind of where we are now, but also some of the historical considerations and context around this as well. Really interesting. Before we move, we're going to move on now to Troy Lee. So a very different perspective from a different part of the music industry. Troy is the founder of Death Rave, and I'm going to let you, Troy, explain what that is all about and your perspectives on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think I'm going to explain a little bit more about how Death Rave started and the success over the years. Okay, so my name is Troy Lee, aka DJ Chinaman. Basically raised in Hackney, London. I'm quarter Chinese, quarter Vietnamese, and half English. My father is from the Caribbean, a country called Guyana. So got a mixture of flavors, and Hackney is very similar to Brixton with a very strong Caribbean community. So musical wise, it's a very good advantage for me when I was growing. And so as you can see, I'm deaf, I'm all spoken. I have a twin brother who's hearing, and I'm the deaf one. So as you can see that I'm talking, speaking, is that I thank you my mother, that she was my speech therapist from the age of 2 to the age of 11, practicing speaking every day for like an hour or two. She had concern how I was going to communicate when I was growing up. So thanks, Mum. Yes, okay, so Death Rave, we, obviously I have passion in music and DJing and going to raves back in the 90s in my teenage years. At that time, the deaf people in the community, they weren't really into the music scene. So, but their culture was like go to the pub once a month, and it was cool. But during that period, and that moment there, I've asked many deaf people to come and join in music and go partying. It wasn't their culture, so nobody was interested. But as the time goes on, the deaf pubs will eventually get banned because there was a lot of issues and communication barriers. So, for example, after the deaf pub, we would go to Soho, a nightclub, and the bouncer would say, "You lot ain't coming in." I was like, "What? You lot are deaf and you lot ain't coming in." So I was like, wow, that's the first time I ever really faced discrimination. So after that, I got made redundant from my normal office job and had to decide what am I going to do with my future. That's when the Deaf Wave came about back in 2003. The first event was 700 people, all tickets sold out in 2 months, and about 200 people from international came. The deaf community is real tight and well connected, and basically put me on the map. Those 200 international deaf people basically loved my concept and took that concept to their countries, and it just blossoms, which is cool. Yeah, so yeah, I have faced several barriers over the years. It's nothing's been easy with deaf and disabled people, as we all know. Um, but we heavily rely on funding from the Arts Council. Without the Arts Council, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. So thank you so much for these guys there. They already know my track record and so on. But over the years, we kind of like from parties, we provided showcases. And I always believe and strongly have passionate about providing a platform for deaf performers to show their skills and that kind of stuff. So that kind of really my kind of work at the moment. But this year alone, we've had a couple of problems, such as the COVID. It cancelled 5 of my events and festivals. So the Arts Council kind of rescued me and bailed me out this year from the Emergency Response Fund. And yeah, so it helped me to put on a last event I've just done, which is the Summer Festival virtual online. Now, during the lockdown period, I mean, none of us in my Deaf Wave collective, which is a bunch of song artists, dancers, music producers, visual performers, we didn't know what we we're going to do with ourselves. But I had to motivate them all and say, look, okay, we obviously got no events and festival, but we have now had time to learn something new and start preparing. So obviously virtual, it's all streaming. So we had an advantage from probably April to start practicing streaming from our DJ radio shows. So it was a really cool experience. And apart from that, I have to also forgot to mention that Ruth, thank you very much for her to send me to Asia 2 years ago and provided a unique Deaf Wave experience alike in Asia, in Indonesia. Obviously, they don't have deaf parties like we have over here. So it was a barrier that was broken down, and I'm very happy with the success of it. We also did some music workshops, DJ workshop using the sub pack, which is a vibration backpack that had never been done before. So again, another barrier broken down. So I'm never expecting my wildest dreams that I'm just constantly breaking barriers all the time. That's only because I'm coming up with different coping strategies of what we could do or what we can try and do. Sometimes, technology is a wonderful thing. How do I say it? If it wasn't for technology, I don't think I would be able to pull off the last event, which included 36 deaf performers from all over the world and all 4 continents. So again, I had to come up with ideas and what can we do? I mean, let's break the ice. We've got to do something. And so, yeah, that's the kind of vibes that we got through. And the barriers that I'm having issues right now is working on my next project because I don't have any fundings at the moment. But this project that I'm actually working on is called Sign of Freedom, made by Dr. Paddy Ladd. Now, for those who don't know Dr. Paddy Ladd, he is the giant of Deaf World. He is Mr. Deaf Culture. Yeah. And there are very few deaf musicians or deaf book writers or anything, but this guy is all in one. It took him 40 years to compile about 80 songs on this book that's only just come out recently. So, as you can imagine, are there many deaf musicians? No. So that's another barrier that I'm going to be hopefully to overcome. And hopefully from this session here, we bring some new people on board. So it's all about creating new ideas, collaborating with new people, and especially with the deaf and disabled. Yeah, so like I say, we heavily rely on funding. We had, like I said, 5 events was cancelled this year, such as Brent Council, Battersea Art Centre, South Bank. So I've now put all my energy on this new idea based on Paddy Ladd's book, which is called a Cynical, which is music, sign songs, and he's got very powerful messages to inform to everyone. I mean, for example, the opening line of the book is to all the deaf children and their parents, past and present, who have suffered from the suppression of our sign languages and cultures, and to all those who have believed in the potential of deaf sign song as a tool for our liberation. Yeah, so I think for deaf people in our community, with a lack of musicians, it's because we don't really hear music, we don't really have the tools or the educational to be taken serious with us, that we really want to learn music and so on. But I think disabled people and deaf people, we should collaborate. I mean, I know there is a limitation of help out there, but by cooperating together and partnership, and let's break down some barriers together. So I think that would be a tremendous positive thing. So if you really like to get involved, please email deafwave@gmail.com. But yeah, I think overcoming barriers, I mean, we're always going to have that. It's always going to be the case. So I think the most important thing is to create allies, and that will be a better future for all. So it doesn't matter if you can't communicate in BSL, there's always an interpreter or a note taker, or do it in messages. So I think it would be a really interesting journey, if you want to put it that way, to go onto this new projects and ideas. I think, like I say, technology, there are millions of deaf and disabled people out there. And there's always going to be 1 or 2 people that's going to be very similar to you. So it's just a question of getting yourself out there and finding them. But yeah, those are the barriers that I have in the music industry. There's not enough deaf musicians and performers. So that's something that we're trying to develop and work on. That's pretty much what I have to say, really. So I hope you enjoyed listening. And yeah, thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Troy. Thank you very, very much. I found that both inspiring. I really love the sort of call to arms element of what you're talking about. Also, interesting, isn't it, that in an organisation like Deaf Rave, working with contemporary culture just as a given, I find it inspiring and interesting, and lots of there are lots of lessons I can take, and I think that the classical music industry can take from an organisation like Death Rave. A lot of legacy traditional institutions and orchestras are so much slower to react to these trends in cultures, and also you talk about the COVID pandemic and how you pivoted your work. Very often, I see many examples of orchestras, sadly, who are not pivoting as quickly as I think they need to be in order to stay relevant to their audiences and to further on the art form. So thank you for all of that. Um, our last speaker today is Sarah Leanne Lewis. Sarah is another composer, and it's over to you, Sarah, to introduce yourself and to give your view on this. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Sarah. I am a classical composer and I'm based in Cardiff in Wales. I'm recently actually the BBC National Orchestra of Wales's composer associate, so affiliate, sorry. So that's a really exciting development in my work journey. I'm going to be reading off a transcript today because my illness and disability means I have like a lot of brain fog and cognitive difficulties at times. So this week's been a bit iffy. So please bear with me, and also bear with the muddling of words. That's quite a normal thing for me, which I'll explain. So I'm going to talk a little bit about invisible disabilities because I have ME and fibromyalgia. So ME is short for myalgic encephalomyelitis, or more commonly known as chronic fatigue syndrome. It's a long-term health condition that affects approximately 250,000 people in the UK. And different people experience a variety of different symptoms that can have a disabling impact on everyday life. And these symptoms can be physical and cognitive. I don't know how many people know much about ME. There is a lot more awareness about it at the moment because of long COVID, which symptoms from long COVID actually have a lot of overlap on symptoms that a lot of us experience with ME, which include debilitating fatigue, muscle and joint pain, disturbed sleep, swollen glands, nausea, dizziness, poor temperature control, difficulties with concentration and memory, word finding difficulties that I mentioned when I was beginning, and often difficulty processing and understanding information, particularly when it's quite a time constraint, when you're in a sort of a situation where you need to answer very quickly. Sometimes we work a little bit slower. So I have what would be on the scale of ME would be more mild to moderate. I can still work part-time. I do have help from my husband in terms of doing household activities, which means that it frees up a lot of my limited energy to focus on work when I need to. There's no known cause for what causes ME. And because of that, there's no medical treatment or cure. So those of us with the condition mean we're offered help to just manage symptoms and manage our mental and emotional well-being. So I had ME, I've had it for 15 years now. So it's pretty much been through my entire adult life. I got ill with a virus at the age of 17 and never got better, basically. And because of when it happened in my life, it meant that I had a very normal and privileged experience actually as a child and teenager, being able to do a multitude of musical activities, being able to go to so many school and county choirs and orchestras. And other than knowing that my aunt had a disability called Emmy, I didn't really know much about it, and it wasn't an experience of my own. And then I got ill, and it changed how I approached life inevitably. Luckily, again, I had the privilege of my aunt being ill with it, and I had that emotional support immediately from her. And she was great in just showing that life is a bit different, but it's manageable. And I think for me, most of my barriers have been perhaps accidentally put in place by myself, because I've been more reticent to speak about my disability. People see me as very normal. There's nothing physically wrong with me. And it's only perhaps when people notice I'm muddling words, or that I'm not able to do the physical things that other people are able to do. I struggle with stairs. I struggle with standing for long periods of time. That people are maybe a little bit aware of it. And especially at the beginning, I was convinced I would recover. People were saying it was a post-viral thing. And until it was only in the second year of university where I basically got to the point in my degree where if I didn't ask for help, I wouldn't be able to continue. So I felt really embarrassed about it, having to ask for help. It's not something that we are good at doing as humans. I think we like to be able to cope ourselves. So I asked for help. I had amazing support from Cardiff University, actually. They were incredible. And without them, I wouldn't have been able to do my 2 degrees. Since graduating, I've had different experiences working in the musical world. I've had negative experiences from organisations that have been interested in working with me. And one example is an organisation that's based quite remotely, wanted to work with me, asked me to interview. And I said, I can't do a site interview. It was a 5-hour journey there and a 5-hour journey back for like an hour interview. And I said, I can't do this because of my physical limitations. That would cause significant impact on the days following in terms of my recovery. And they turned around and said, we don't want to work with you then, because I was putting too much, I was creating a difficulty for them. And that was really frustrating and really upsetting at the time. It was the first time people had reacted to me being very open about my Emmy, and I think that kind of shut down a certain amount of me being able to talk about it for a while, because I thought in an industry that really glorifies busyness as a mark of success, not being able to do the same things, not being able to travel as much, not being able to work as hard or as long hours, or be able to literally like jump from Cardiff to London and back in a day. Saying you've got limitations, that means you can't do that, means that you might be putting barriers in front of people wanting to work with you because they need that person, that sort of person who's able to do those things. But I've had really positive experiences as well. The RSNO, who are based in Scotland, they're based in Glasgow. I was on their Composers Hub a couple of years ago, and at the time I was going through a significant relapse in my Emmy. And I had a chat with the orchestra manager. It was the launch of the Composers Hub, and I said, I don't know whether I can even get up there, because I was in a lot of chronic pain at the time. And what was so encouraging and made me just think this is the right organization to work with was her immediate response was, don't worry, if you can't make it, you can't make it. We'll figure out a way of doing it. But if you make it and you can't cope at any point, take time out, do what you need to do, and we'll fit around you. We'll work with you because we want to work with you. And so I ended up flying up there. I remember crying in the airport because I was in so much pain. I was on heavy medication at the time and just nothing was touching the pain. And they were just incredible. Really, really understanding of the limitations through the days, and kind of quietly checked in on me as well, right through the scheme, not just in the launch, but I had a huge amount of emotional support there. And now I'm obviously working with the BBC National Orchestra of Wales, who are also incredible. And I don't think Lisa, the director, would mind me saying this, that she and I had a chat when it was back in September, I think just before the announcement, where she knew about my disability from previous talks when she was working with the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra. And she asked me how open I wanted to be about my disability. And it was great to have that permission of I could choose whether I could be open about it, or I could choose to kind of be quiet about it, but they would still put things in place. But the great thing was also that Lisa said, you can use this as a platform to be able to share my experiences and have that privilege of being someone who at the moment is seen as part of that organisation, to be able to share experiences of being disabled and still working in the industry is great, because my disability is very much a part of me. It's shaped who I am. It's shaped the music I create. I've got heightened sensory experiences because of the ME. I'm very, very sensitive to sound, to light, and to smell. And along with that, and because of the brain fog and the need to rest and slow down, it immediately affects the music I'm drawn to and the sounds that I like to hear and use as well in my music. And it affects how I work in terms of rehearsals, like the practical elements of working. I have to have a rest before a rehearsal. I have to have time because it's exhausting. And then I'll also have to have time between a rehearsal and a concert to take time out. And I'm always feeling a little bit rude because after the rehearsal finishes, I'm like one of the first out the door because I need to find that quiet space that like I will have to eat to make sure my energy's keeping okay. And then I will basically find the quietest place in the building. Might be like a dark corner, it might just even be the bathroom because I can't find anywhere else, and I will just sit. Even if it's for like 15-20 minutes, it's really important for me to have that time. That means I get to recover from the rehearsal, and means that I can then get through the concert without kind of crashing. And crashing for me means I have an immediate onset of severe fatigue, severe brain fog, my limbs and muscles and joints hurt a huge amount. And it has happened several times in the past where it's hit me so bad that I can't speak properly, and I actually physically can't speak very well. So yeah, there's a lot of physical limitations that I think a lot of people aren't aware of when talking about kind of how to accommodate disabilities, especially invisible disabilities in the workplace and in the music industry. I'm really happy to kind of talk more about ME, and I've got a few links that I might put in the chat as well, because there's a really good way of understanding the limitations of ME is something called spoon theory, which is used for a lot of chronic illnesses. It's amazing. I'll put the YouTube link in, and it really helps understand how there's a sort of set amount of energy that each person has per day, and we can use it up so quickly without realizing. And I'll put a couple of links to, there's a film on Netflix called Unrest, and that's about Emmy. It's brilliant. And a link to a composer as well called Amble Scoos, who is an incredible composer. She has Emmy and she's really outspoken about it and just amazingly open about her experiences. So she's absolutely worth checking out as well. So thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much. Again, another really informative speaker. Thank you also for going into some detail around the condition of ME, because it's a condition that I don't know an awful lot about. Many people don't know an awful lot about. I think what you say is also interesting because actually perhaps in all three of the speakers today, very often with hidden disabilities of this kind, it raises all kinds of really interesting questions around when, where, how should you declare your disability, and also just to, you know, I can't let go that that sort of horrifying story you said about, you know, being invited to interview and then having that interview rescinded. I mean, as someone said in the chat, that is just flat out illegal and discriminatory, and it's just shocking that something so flagrant like that can still be happening, actually. Thank you. It's great to now see some questions coming through on the Q&A, and we will get to those after the break. Please, anyone out there in the ether, put your questions in. They're coming in through fast now. Brilliant. We'll take a short 7 or 8 minute break in just a second and start the next part of our discussion. Lovely to see all your faces, by the way. I don't know if you're aware, for those of you in the audience, we couldn't see you during the first part, during the webinar part with the discussion with our speakers. We knew you were out there, but now we know you were really out there. So welcome all. There was a question in the chat about last week's talk as well, from Joe and Gareth, who both joined us again today. Hi guys. You'll be able to catch up with their talks also after the session. We'll make sure the recordings or transcripts are circulated within a few weeks of both of these sessions. So on to your questions. I'm going to read through the questions we've had already in the Q&A and throw it open to our panel. And then if we have time after that, we'll just throw the floor open to any further questions. So the first question I have here from anonymous attendee is, amazing talk guys, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I want to know, what in your opinion and experience can non-disabled allies do to support the removal of all these barriers? Who would like to start on that out of Sarah, Troy or Ben? Do you have any thoughts on that? Sarah, you'll just have to unmute yourself if that's all right. I think you're talking.
In some ways, I sort of think, I don't mean this to sound harsh at all, but not relying on us to educate. Like, I think it's really important to, for people, if they want to be allies, to actually also do a lot of work in educating themselves and not expect us to have to explain ourselves all the time. And yeah, I don't mean that to sound harsh at all, but it can be exhausting having to explain my disability to everyone that I come across and then also explain exactly what it means for me when they, yeah. But everyone's really different, and I appreciate that. I think also just in terms of accessibility, being aware of those constraints that might be in your building or in the way that you work, that as an able-bodied ally you may not be aware of, in terms of, like Ben was saying, the measurements of steps. It sounds really daft. That can make such a difference in terms of the height of the step, for people who've got issues in terms of walking. And yeah, I guess sort of evaluating those kind of things might be hard, but it is worth doing.
Thank you, Sarah. I think just to reflect on that answer as well, I know at Power Orchestra, obviously a big part of our work is to make sure that our musicians feel supported to do their best work in whatever environment we work in. And often when we go to venues on behalf, we might do a site visit to a venue somewhere, and they assume straight away that the sorts of requirements we'll be looking at most will be things like wheelchair ramps, and things like that, which of course are important. And as someone said earlier as well, I think Ben mentioned, there are still concert halls in the UK that don't have stages that are accessible for performers to get onto. So of course that's important, but I think your point around the more subtle and hidden disabilities and therefore requirements you might have are often overlooked and forgotten about, and you just need people to listen to you well and truly when you give those requirements. Another question here from Eleanor Bennett: how can other musicians help to raise awareness? So it's along the same sorts of lines, like Ben or Troy. I don't know if you'd like to answer that. Go on, Ben.
Yes, as you said, Lloyd, they both sort of feed together, because the question is you can only gain awareness by making sure that you can get disabled people in place, and the more disabled people there are in a place, the easier it is for awareness to get about, and so on. I think one thing we need to always make sure with this kind of stuff is we use the old Gramscian idea of structure and superstructure when it comes to this kind of battles. What we mean, and what Antonio Gramsci meant by this, is this idea that there are small things that are built in by just personal interaction, or the smaller elements that are essentially how one person deals with another person. So this could be saying the right words to people, or racism in those kind of instances. Whereas the superstructure are the bigger things that help keep it in place and create the bigger problems that are much harder to get rid of. And so for a disabled person, as like Sarah pointed out, how tiring rehearsals can be, but because for most orchestras, they're trying to be as cost effective as possible, they'll often squeeze to as few rehearsals as possible to make sure that they can save money, even though that is done with the intention of essentially keeping the orchestra going for a very long time and not running into debt. That in itself creates a problem. And there are other sort of similar kind of scenarios which we can then talk about. Oh, it's very nice to raise awareness, but when it is built into the superstructure, it is much harder to deal with, and it needs a much bigger shift to make happen. So we can, it's not to sort of discourage people from wanting to raise awareness and do this very nice positive things, but it's always this understanding that there are certain things that you can't do alone, and we have to address the hydra that is the problem, not just one of its single necks, as it were. But I also think, just on another general thing, as well as it's just promoting and just chatting about disabled people, much in the same way that the PRS organisation have pushed for the 50-50 representation in concerts and various other different bits. That is a good thing to aim for, push for disability to be representative of society. If we look at the arts in the portfolio organisations, I think disabled people make up 5% of full-time workforce within Arts Council England's portfolio organisations. That's 5% of the population, whereas reality is disabled people probably make up between 15 and 20%. So there is a big gap somewhere. There is also other issues that go outside of the concert hall that we need to worry about as well. Not all trains are accessible. Not all buses are accessible. Not all of us can drive. Not all of us can communicate. All these other things as well. So there are all these various different Essentially, how I described it to the Queen's Hall is anything a person can interact with can be a barrier, and we need to. That is the way to sort of address it. If you want to make sure that your concert is very good for disabled people, how much are people blocked by every step to get from their home to the concert hall? And it's all those kind of things that if we build it bit by bit, we can do wonderful things. And I'm glad to see that Ruth has put in the chat about aptitude is everything, and they do fantastic work on that front. And to be fair, their work fed a lot of the research that I did last year with the Queen's Hall and Drake Music Scotland for the concert. So they are a great example of that one. So yeah, so I'll stop waffling. So
Thanks, Ben. No, and just before you go as well, I think just on this, as well as these kind of access, we're talking today a lot about solutions to access requirements, but also and the sort of the structural issues that you raised there. What are your feelings as a composer? Can you reflect a little bit more about on the kind of the how maybe the art itself needs to change as well? Do orchestras need to kind of, I might slightly give away my own prejudices here, but do they need to get with the program basically and be commissioning artwork that is far more responsive and dynamic, and not simply do another performance of Chike 5, which is lovely, and I love Chike 5, but actually making art that is more exciting and modern, basically. What are your feelings on that?
yeah, I have many thoughts on this, and I will try and find a link and share with everyone. I did an article for the Morning Star a few months back discussing about how the COVID crisis just sort of has underlined a lot of the bigger internal problems within classical music, namely for many people, like if you live in Inverness, your nearest orchestra professionally is Glasgow. That is a 3-hour train. So of course, not many people in Inverness are going to gain interest in classical music when they have to travel 3 hours. Whereas if you compare it to football, there is a football team in almost every single nook and cranny of this nation. And so that is one thing in itself. But I think also when we talk about the responsibility of the orchestra, we can make it reflective of society as much as we can, but the other problem as well is if disabled people can't get from the position of, say, being born and can't even get to the stage of getting an interest in music, they can't then go on and be composers. And so we can do a lot of jigging and making sure that the coverage of disabled composers is very good in the arts and by professional orchestras and so on. But if we're in a position where the majority of disabled people don't get to go to university, we're then not going to get many disabled people going to music colleges and then going on to be great composers. And it's all those kind of steps all the way up that create those kind of problems. As another sort of comparison I always like doing is Britain is still the nation in Europe with the highest rate of teenage pregnancy. Who ends up looking after the baby 9 times out of 10? It's the teenage mum, not the teenage dad. And so the teenage dad is likely to be able to go off and do whatever they want, but the teenage mum is then stuck with the child, and it's very hard to do a degree while you have a kid. And it's those kind of things that if you don't take them into consideration, no matter how much you change, say, representation and all this various sort of different stuff in concert halls, it still doesn't fix the problem. All it does is just bandage the wound, maybe at best, but it doesn't actually address the bigger problems that create the problem, as it were, or the foundations that create that problem.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, it'd be really good if you can find did you say the Morning Star where you wrote that article where you embellished on some of that? We'll see if we can find the link to that. And Troy, just before I move on to, I will come to some more questions in a minute, but Troy, I just wanted to bring your perspective in here, because obviously you're working in an area of music or entertainment that maybe has less of a kind of traditional pyramid structure. So people who maybe start learning an instrument in school and then go to university and study music and play an instrument. I mean, they might well do that, but I imagine that in Deaf Rave you actually have many creatives and artists who aren't doing it that way and actually find maybe their journey into this kind of work much easier.
Yeah, I'm pretty much old school style, really. Well, first of all, out of my 5 brothers and sisters, I'm the only one that never went to university. It's just like Ben pointed out, it's a classic example for deaf children. We're basically a lost generation, man. During that period, the lack of access to education needs and communication access. Yeah, it's very tough, and the problem as we speak to this very day, it's still going. It's nothing changes, apart from putting a few BSL interpreters there and there. But I don't really want to get into this politics story too much. But I know that for a fact that the deaf people in the deaf community, we just definitely didn't get a chance, and therefore it was hardcore, man. It was hardcore. Um, Such a shame, really, because I think it's all linked with oralism and the band of sign language in 1880 in Milan. They believe that all was the better method. So you've got a lost generation, and we basically missed out. So every day I meet different kinds of people, pros and cons, and my usual way of approaching people is just to be humble, but at the same time, when we communicating with them, it's basically show me your empathy, and then show me your emotion, and then I'll tell you who you are. That kind of story, because every body language that you show, it just shows whether it's positive or negative. And for most deaf people and from our community, we can see it straight out. So there's a lot of mistrust and that kind of thing, because we've been taken advantage many times, 1,000 times. So the bridge between the hearing community and the deaf community and disabled, it's quite wide. So, but nowadays there is a few awarenesses that's improving. A few organisation is trying to make good things happening, such as attitude is everything, and performance interpreting and so on. Yeah, it's still a long journey. It's still a lot of broken bridges, but I think deaf and disabled people have the responsibility of raising these issues through the social media, which is very powerful. I mean, what I'm seeing on Instagram, for example, it's just pure comedy. I mean, we're getting deaf comedy people like with 100,000 K followers, but it's not the actual real deaf awareness. It's just for the community just to have a banter, but it's not in a real fixing bridge kind of thing. It's a different ball game, to be honest. And for example, we had a demonstration a couple of weeks ago. Where is the interpreter campaign with the Boris Johnson briefing? They still haven't got BSL interpreters in place compared to Scotland and Ireland and Wales. I mean, I think we're going backwards still.
Thank you, Troy. Much to ponder in there. Let's have the next question. There's a question from Natasha Hurst. Does more need to be done in schools to make musical education accessible to deaf and disabled children? Also, careers advice. How can this be more aspirational? Maybe Ben or Sarah. Ben?
So this I can rant for days about this topic. So it's one in the sense of the big problem we see is music education across Britain has been dwindling for a very, very long time, which has meant that various different communities are missing out, regardless of if they're deaf, disabled or not. For example, Sunderland, my hometown, just the ability to get music has disappeared entirely. The only reason I got into music myself was because of brass bands, and that was because they're built as a communal thing. They're not a state-funded thing at any point, and so that's how I was able to get in. When it comes to education, there's that basic level which needs to be everywhere. Every child should have access to that, and so that is one literal level to be able to address it. When it comes to specifically for deaf and disabled children to learn, there's sort of multiple things that feed it. One is being able to feed that curiosity. So how often can the child in question get to hear music of any sort, of any kind of genre? How often do they get to hear it or get to interact with it in any form? Then from there is a question of, once they've got that curiosity, is then having the right teachers to be able to build on the curiosity and make it into something more, not just as you should only like this music, but more in the sense of, we see you like this music, this is also like that, and building it upwards and just building on where the interest is to help make them as broad and as interesting as possible as musicians. From there, once you have that kind of stuff within the school environment, music lessons are a bit more difficult because there's so many kids you have to cater for. But if you're able to get the external lessons, then it comes to working in groups becomes slightly easier because you've then had that tuition with you. We also have the issue of not all instruments are accessible. So this is where things like iPads, brain fingers, and various other different forms of accessible music technology are a really great avenue. We then also have things of the questions of notation, where because of various different cognitive circumstances, different notations are more complicated than others. So figure notes is a fantastic one, which are based in Edinburgh, and essentially they start off with different colors representing different notes, and then different shapes representing different octaves. And then you place the stickers on the piano and you can learn to play like that. And it's the same on guitar as well. So you can then learn to then see the visual shapes and build it that way. And then from there, you can go and develop it between that all the way through to natural notation, which is a good way into it. And this is thinking of the aspirational bit. When we think about that kind of element, we need to make sure that when we're talking about equality and disabled musicianship, be it whatever genre, we have to be making equality so then it is in a position that a disabled person could be the best at that music. If you're just thinking as a scenario where the music is equal so then they can be just as good as everyone else, that's not enough. You need to be able to create a scenario where they in turn, by their own ability as artists, become the best. And so until we're in that kind of position where every single step can be met, they have the same opportunities to learn, to be able to get the best kind of learning they can get. If you don't fill that up, we're never going to get to the top bit. And once we got to a position where that base is there, it's then making sure that the vision is to get to the very, very top. To sort of paraphrase James Connolly, we're not free until we have everything from the starry plough down to the earth. And that's sort of the vision that we should be taking.
Oh, Ben, thank you. I think it's, yeah, here. It's really interesting as well, isn't it? How, because of the current education system we have, certainly again, I only use classical music as an example because that's the world I'm most familiar with. But if we think of the grade system, and the system of examinations by boards like the ABRSM or Trinity, grades 1 to 8, and then diploma, and then on to music college, that system has taken a long time to build up in the way that it does, and it's based ostensibly on the orchestral model. So, you can take a grade in each instrument of the orchestra, but even, for instance, jazz grades, they've only recently, in the grand scheme of things, in the last 10, 20 years, really kind of come online in the same way. And so I think that point you raise is a really important one about an attainment system, or a system that measures effectively a disabled musician's progress, particularly those who might use electronic instruments and this new technology that's coming through. And I know Open Up Music, which I know many of you will be familiar with. Open Up Music is another charity based here in Bristol, and they run the National Open Youth Orchestra, which is the world's first youth orchestra, nationwide youth orchestra, working with children who are disabled and play instruments that are outside of that kind of traditional canon of work. There's another question here from Jan Underwood. It is awful to be discriminated at work, but the effort that it takes to fight that is often too much. How do we get around that? I wonder if, Sarah, you might have something to say about that.
Yeah, it's, I guess, using the example that I spoke about, it's exhausting and it's demoralizing as well. It makes us feel less than. How to get around it? For me, I choose I will be very careful about who I choose to work with. And I can tell quite early on in discussions whether they are an organisation who are open to doing things differently, and facilitating kind of having these conversations that are needed for accessibility, and yeah, I think we do have to be open about it. I think the discrimination has been there for too long, and it's going to take a long time for it to not be there, unfortunately. And I think everyone has that responsibility to be part of that discussion as well, and to, if whether able-bodied or disabled, if we see something that actually looks like discrimination, to call it out as well, and not to call it out with rudeness, but call it out with kindness, and kind of help everyone get to a point where this isn't an issue. Yeah, calling it out with kindness, definitely.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, especially in a time where, you know, our national discourse has been so, whatever your politics, you know, has been so coarse and divided. I think that's a really timely reminder. We have about less than 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to invite, if there's anyone who has a burning question. I think we just have time for one question from anyone from the floor, or even just a reflection on what you've heard today would be lovely, and then we'll bring the webinar to a close. Maybe you could either raise your hand in your screen and I hopefully will see you, or just unmute and shout.
Yeah.
Hi, Joe.
Hi. So I just wanted to ask Sarah a question about her music. And I was just wondering whether she'd unpack it a bit. So you said something in the talk about your impairment, disability, kind of like feeding into your music. And what I understand of your music, it's deeply poetic and visceral and ornate. And I was just wondering whether you could unpack how you feel it does that, and how I can experience that as a listener. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. It's like, for me, because I have this very heightened sensitivity to sound, it annoys my husband no end. Because he like, I have to tell him like inside voices all the time. So I can hear things very, very clearly. I can hear electronics that are on standby. I can hear that sound. So in my music, I use lots of different, very subtle textures, and I will look at how to reiterate the same pitch in like several different ways, because for me, I can hear that pitch in all of those different ways, like depending on the placement of the harmonics on a stringed instrument, I can hear those differences. And some musicians, I've had arguments with them. I think Ben was actually there for one of them. He'll remember this. I had an argument with a string quartet because they were like, there's no difference with these two harmonics. They produce the same pitch. They're just in, like, one's in an easier position to get to, one's slightly more complicated. And I was adamant, for me, those two pitches sounded different. It was the texture that went alongside them. So a lot of my pieces are very purposely still, very slow moving, and really exploring those different textures and timbres that the instruments create, the very quiet noises that sort of feel very kind of inside the instrument.
Amazing. Thank you, Sarah. That's such an interesting point as well. Like, that really speaks to me as a hearing impaired musician, because a lot of my music, I have hearing loss, particularly in the high frequency of my hearing range, and so I've noticed that the character of my music is directly influenced by that. Not consciously, but just kind of unconsciously, I tend to be drawn to instruments that are earthy and bassy and powerful, and therefore textures that kind of work in the same way. And so that's neither an advantage nor a disadvantage. It just is, you know, and this is where it comes back to this whole idea of, you know, disabled people have experiences to share, just yes, they might be subjective or objective, but it's the most interesting thing when those experiences can come out in the music. Oh, I love that phrase. Yeah, Rose Babby. We create beautiful arts experiences by our lived experience of disability. Yeah, you put it better than me, Ruth. Thank you. I'm afraid I think we have to finish, but thank you so much to our three panelists for three amazing contributions today, and also to the three panelists who were here last week as well, Joe, Gareth, and Mark. Thank you all very much. Thank you to all of you for coming and being part of it. We'll make sure all of the information and links are disseminated. Thank you to Disability Arts Cymru and T Cares and Arts Council Wales for supporting these talks and these Crip Talks. I found them really interesting. And
can I interject?
Yes, please do,
Everyone
Ruth.
doesn't mind giving Lloyd a great appreciation for what he's done by waving our hands into the cameras and saying thank you, Lloyd.
Oh.
Fantastic chair and linking the two conversations. And I thank you for all who participated in this. Sorry, it's Ruth Fabi here, bullying in from Disability Arts Cymru. And it's been great working with Deborah Kaiser from TCARE on this, but the conversations are rich. There is so much to unpick from these last 2 weeks. So I think you're going to hear more about this as we develop. So I can't thank you enough for being part of it and for sharing and asking questions, and also all the access in place as well. Thank you for those workers coming in, especially for Catherine, who should have had another worker here, but they pulled out on us. So she's done a sterling job. So can we give her a real appreciation as well? So thank you, Catherine, for all you've done. And for also Rachel for being the hostess with the mostess with the Zooming. She's been fantastic. So thank you, everyone. We'll be in touch. Keep in touch with us. Get the information that's in the chat. But we'll make sure you'll be able to get some of this from recording and from transcripts as well. Be safe. Take care. And thank you all so, so much.
Gio. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Thanks, Steph. Lovely to see you both.